When you've decided that you're going to use Agile for your project management, the very first step is to create a project backlog. The project backlog is simply a list of all of the things that are going to be included in the project, but they're written in a very specific way. The individual items which form the project backlog are called user stories. They're called this because they're written from the perspective of the user, and they're supposed to be story-like in the sense that they're not very formal, they're almost conversational in tone. The structure of the sentence which forms the user story is very specific, however. The structure is as a, and then the name of the actor, I must, and then a description of what must happen, so that, and then the description of why that must happen. The reason that they're written in this way is so that all of the focus throughout the project is on the user. The user is the most important part of the project, and if we're not able to deliver user stories, the user won't be able to perform the actions that they need to perform. An example of a user story from the Video Manager series is as follows. As a developer, I want a hardware platform so that they can select appropriate software solutions. In that case, the developer is the user. The end user, the person who's going to use the software, isn't necessarily going to want to know what hardware they're going to need. They're just going to want to be able to use the software. The use case, in this case I want a hardware platform, allows the developer to actually understand exactly what it is that they've got to provide. The test case, in this case, so that I can select appropriate software solutions, is just that, a test case. It will let the developer know exactly when they've finished that user story. Sometimes you will encounter a user story which seems a lot bigger in scope compared to other user stories within a project. These are often called epics. In the Video Manager series, we gave an example of these. For example, as a developer, I have a platform to work on. When you do encounter these epic stories, they should be broken down and decomposed into smaller stories, ones which can actually be worked on by individual people. It's also common that a user story in itself won't provide all of the information, and so additional information can be attached to user stories. So to continue using the same example, we've attached a few conditions to the user story. The outcome must be cheap, it must be replaceable, it must be reliable. These are additional requirements, and the terminology again is very specific. Must means that it must happen. We could also use should, and the use of the word should indicates that the user strongly desires this outcome, but would be willing to settle for an alternative. There are also must not and should not, which are available to us. And again, you can see that the language is very specific and direct. This allows the person who's going to implement this user story to have the freedom that they need to make the best decision. If we were to write in this user story that we specifically must use a Raspberry Pi, we're automatically ruling out all other options. We should only come to the conclusion that we should use a Raspberry Pi after ruling out those other options, after considering them. Backlogs are typically created as a joint operation between the project manager of a project and the product owner. That product owner could be a third party, for example if you were a consultant hired to develop a software solution. And once all of the individual user stories have been captured, the project manager and the product owner should come to some sort of agreement as to what order the individual user stories should be completed in. This will often follow a very logical order, but it is also possible that business requirements mean that some things need to be produced in different orders. So if security is a huge issue for the product owner, they could assign a higher priority to any user stories which are related to security than they may do for other stories, which they deem less important. It's also worth noting the fact that the order of the user stories in the backlog can and often does change within a project's development cycle. Again, this is often led by the business or the product owner, who will often decide midway through a project that they want to change the order of things to assign higher priority to other things. This is perfectly acceptable, and the Agile methodology does allow this to happen. And so an important point for the developers of any projects to keep in mind is this fact, that the order of things can and often does change, and they shouldn't worry too much about the order things are happening in. If a developer does feel that a story is in a very wrong order, they can feed that back to the project manager and to the product owner, but it is ultimately the decision of the product owner as to what order things happen. They are the ones, after all, who are paying the bill. So at this point we should have a list of user stories in a rough order of preference. In the next video we're going to be looking at sprints, which is the name given to each block of time allocated to work on a specific project, and we'll look at how developers take work from the product backlog and turn that into tangible results. So make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss it.